Let's get going. Hey, put everything else up except for knowing God. Get that out on your desk. Let's turn to chapter 1. Hey, for the next 15, 20 or so minutes, we're just going to talk about chapter 1. Okay, so hopefully, as you were reading that and as we did the speed theology last Wednesday, I think, for you guys, right? That was the last time we've had A-Day. Yeah, whenever we did that last week, hopefully you annotated or highlighted or jotted some things down in the margins of chapter 1. And from here on out, as we go through these chapters, I want you to do that. That way, when we talk about it like we're about to do, you're able just to recall some of the things that maybe stood out to you, make some comments in our discussion or whatnot. So this is an extremely informal discussion about chapter 1. So make sure you're there, chapter 1. That's on page 17. Well, knowing God, hopefully you got that correct on the quiz. That's the title of the book by J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer has been a long time professor / theologian. Okay, I think he was born in the 20s. By the way, he's still alive, like 90-something years old. Okay, so he's been largely influential to the Christian church over literally an entire century. This is probably his most well-known book. I would say this is one of the more well-known books across Christian circles, by the way, knowing God. So he begins in chapter 1, and let's look at some of these things. And you guys talk about some of these things, and give me your thoughts and ideas and what you liked and whatnot. Okay? So join in with me here. Chapter 1 opens with a quote from what pastor in the past? Yeah, Charles Spurgeon. Anybody know about Charles Spurgeon? Yeah, he did. He said those words. He did. That is exactly right. Next time, yeah, that's good. That's good. Charles Spurgeon is the gentleman up here on the wall at the top there. No. I do need a new clock because about a year and a half ago, that wall started shaking out of nowhere. The clock fell on its face, shattered. Yep. And then that's why it stuck on that particular time. So every day I look up there. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah, it's ticking. It's just not moving. So anyways, that's Charles Spurgeon up here at the top. Spurgeon pastored the largest church in the late 1800s in the world, in London. He pastored and preached at what is known as Metropolitan Tabernacle. Okay? You can still go to that church today in London. Thousands of people would pour in to listen to Spurgeon preach. He preached and taught at that particular church for 3.5 decades, 35 years. His sermons, by the way, he would preach a sermon on Sunday morning, and by Wednesday or Thursday of that week, that sermon would have been edited and sent to the newspapers, and all the local newspapers would actually print off those sermons, and they would sell them for 1 penny, and they were called penny pulpits. And those sermons are basically spread across all of the world in the late 1800s. Millions and millions and millions of copies of those, by the way, were purchased. All of the proceeds from that, by the way, were poured back into the 60-plus ministries that he started while he was there in London. Okay, so he's a pretty influential person if you know anything about Christian history. So he did say these words here in chapter 1. And if you remember, he said these words when he was how old? Yeah, he was 20 years old. Now, gosh, if I think back to what I was doing at 20 years old, it wasn't anything to the level of what he wrote here. He started pastoring his first church when he was around 17 or 18 years old. I mean, imagine starting and pastoring a church next year for you guys. That's what Spurgeon did. But I think it would do us well to at least highlight some of the things that he said in this particular quote. The first thing, actually, that I highlighted is here on the first page, where he says that there is something exceedingly improving to the mind when you contemplate God. And he kind of goes on in a few different ways to expand on that particular point. But what does he mean by that? Yeah, thinking about God, and we want to make sure that we add there, thinking rightly about God does what to the mind? It expands it. It enlarges it. It betters the mind. Okay, what else? Like, is this a subject that we'll be able to tackle in a lifetime? No. In fact, Spurgeon goes on to say, look, it's such a vast subject that you can literally contemplate and learn and study God, and you will never what? You'll never complete it. You'll never fully get there. Why? Yeah, we literally cannot ascend to that knowledge here on the earth in our finite minds. And is that okay, by the way? Yeah, absolutely, because that tells us that God is far more what? Yeah, far more wise, far superior to anything that we can grasp. Anything else stick out on this first page or the second page? It wasn't a short quote, so there may be a couple things that we can talk about here. At least on page 18, again, I highlighted that if you think often about God, it literally will increase and expand your mind to something that may have been narrow to something that basically extends as far as the east is from the west. And in other words, contemplating and thinking upon God in a biblical manner has nothing but benefits, right? I mean, are there any negatives to contemplating God? No. Lindsay?
I liked how it talks about how studying scripture and studying God would humble us, because as humans we're very like we want to satisfy ourselves and we're always looking out for our own best interests.
Right.
It's unnatural for us, or it's natural for us to be selfish, even from a young age, and that's something that has been trained out of us. So I liked the idea that the more we study God, the more humble we become.
Yeah. Now, why does it, to play off of that, it's a great point, why does it humble us? I mean, why would you not approach the study of God and be like, man, I'm way better than I thought, actually. Thanks, God.
Proves that, like, no matter how good we are, God's, like, a million times better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still, no matter how long you study God, you're still faced with His pure, holy righteousness. And on the flip side of that, what Paul's been talking about in Romans, you're still faced with your what? Your unrighteousness. Absolutely. Absolutely. So studying God humbles us. It brings us to a point where we know that we aren't God. Okay, what else? Who else wants to add to this?
I like how it said, like, the proper study of Christians is like the Godhead, and like how, like, studying Christianity is like important to know, like, the God you're actually studying.
Yeah. If He's the God of Christianity, then to know Christianity is to know who? Yeah, it really is to know God. By the way, great reference to jot down in the margin here, John 17:3. I mean, Jesus says that eternal life is knowing God. So even Jesus himself understands the value of knowing God, which is the title of this book, to know God. All right, let's move into the first little subsection that we find here in chapter 1 real quick. We've got a few more minutes to do this. What's the point that Packer makes in the little subsection where he basically proposes a question, who needs theology? What was his answer to that? What's that? Everyone? What else?
question clearly assumes that the steady nature of God will be impractical and irrelevant for life.
Okay, yeah, so there are some people out there that want to say, well, theology and doctrine and study of God isn't really practical. But what's the point that he makes? Well, everybody needs theology. Everybody needs to study God because it really is actually the what? It's crucially important, and it is the most practical thing that you could do. In other words, knowing God better, it doesn't get any more practical than that. That's what he's saying. Like you will hear, guys, listen, I'm telling you, you hear this during our time. This is our generation. This is what we are facing. People think that honest, biblical Bible study and theology and doctrine, they believe those things are outdated. But in fact, theology and doctrine couldn't be more pertinent now, right? Now, why is it important? Why does he say in this particular section?
God is crucially important for living our lives.
Yeah, you literally can't live your life correctly unless you know who. Yeah, unless you know God. All right, let's move to the next section here. The basic themes. The basic themes. And for you guys that have these particular sections, you ought to be the one talking the most about it. Okay? The basic themes. I think the part that I highlighted here that I thought that really stood out from the beginning was that, look, we've got to deal and understand and know God, but also once we know God, we will see what sets him apart from us. I think that is profound. We will see the vast difference between the Creator and his creatures. Anybody else find anything in this section? Yeah, Alex.
When it says like we shall deal with the perfections of God, like it goes on to list like what we consider to be the good things, but then it also lists like his wrath and like what like the things that cause him mad. Because like when I think of it, like I don't think of that as like a like a good
Yeah.
thing, like but it is what keeps him perfect and like holy, righteous, so like he can hold us.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some aspects of God that people really don't like to talk about, and maybe you don't hear that often. Or maybe when you think about God, at least when you think about God, what are some of the first things that come to mind when you think about attributes of God? Okay, righteous, holy, loving, gracious, compassionate, long-suffering. How many times have you honestly sat around and thought about the judgment of God, the wrath of God, right? Well, sometimes I think we brush those things to the side, but in order to fully know God, you have to contemplate those particular attributes like you were saying there, Alex. All right, let's move on to the second to last section here. Knowledge applied. I think that is pretty self-explanatory, but what does Packer go on to describe in this particular section? Yeah, how to apply what we have learned, how to apply what we know. In fact, he goes on to say, and I think this is really one of the main themes of chapter 1, that knowing God for intellectual purposes alone isn't really knowing God. What do we mean by that? What does Packer mean by that? Read.
Your intentions, like if you're just doing it to know the facts about him and know that stuff, like it says that if we pursue theological knowledge for its own sake, it is bound to go bad on us. And it's like if you're studying him for the wrong purpose, not to get like an actual relationship with him, then it's not a true knowledge of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so he makes the point, and this is clear in the scripture. Knowing God for merely knowing facts about and of God is missing the entire point of actually what? Knowing God. In other words, a true knowledge of God comes attached with living for God. No, that's why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says a good tree bears good what? Fruit. Yeah, so a right understanding of God bears what? Right living, godly conduct, Christ likeness. Okay, so go with me here. You're on campus from 8 to 4, 8 to 5, 8 to 6, for some of you guys that are here later. How can your knowledge of God help you through the day? Like, how could you apply that now? What's that? Okay, endurance, perseverance, patience, yeah. What about other scriptures we can think of about grumbling and complaining? Yeah, I mean, I think I need to recite that one often in my head when I'm doing lesson plans and inputting grades and calculating averages. It's the worst time of my life. And I want to complain and grumble about those things. So how can a knowledge of God be applied to me directly in that aspect of my job? Anybody want to help me out here? A wretched sinner that needs help. I'm asking for help. Take how I know God's character to be and emulate that. Imitate that. How could you walk down to lunch and your knowledge of God can help you in that situation when we just want to grumble and complain about all of the food that we have down there? Oh yeah, let's just be practical, man. We're up here 9 months out of the year, right? So surely we can take our knowledge of God and practically apply it to how we live here on campus. Anyone was complained about the food situation? Is it just me? About the chicken maybe being a little tough? Okay. Right? Like, I mean, if we honestly think about that, we can take our knowledge of God and we can apply it to those particular situations, can we not? We can, right? Absolutely. All right, let's finish up here. Let's go over to the last section. The last section on page 23. Meditating on the truth. Now, what are some of the first things that we think of when we see or hear or read about meditation? Right? Yeah, but in reality, guys, when we're talking about meditation, biblically speaking, well, what is meditation? When it gets down to its basic definition, what does Packer talk about here? Meditation is just doing what? Yeah, dwelling on, contemplating, thinking about what you know of God. Okay, it isn't sit around, you have to sit on top of a pillow with your hands out to your side making weird humming noises or anything that you would think of initially when you think of meditation. Meditation is literally learning about God and thinking about what you just learned. Contemplating those things in your mind. And according to Packer, what will that do? The more you meditate on God, what does it do to the mind? Yeah, it expands the mind and the heart. Okay? All right, guys, we are done talking about knowing God, chapter 1.